Okay, well, my name is Florence, but I always go by Flo Trippi. I serve as now the Region 6 president. I have been active in CSEA since the mid-'70s, which I don't like to admit. But the mid-'70s, I worked for the Monroe County Health Department. In fact, I started with the health department back in 1968. I was a real kid then, and ended up in the early 70s finding out about CSEA. I had started with the health department in '68, and no one had ever talked to me about CSEA. Someone had come to me and said, sign this card, which I did, and that was it. And I didn't know much about it. And in the mid-'70s, there had been a problem with one of our employees. A woman who worked as a 10-month school employee ended up taking a trip to go pick up her son in Virginia. And when she went to pick up her son, she was killed in an auto accident. Her family ended up having a tremendous amount of problems. The retirement system refused to pay her the annuity because she was on a no-pay day. She took it unauthorized and so on and so on. So they gave her a real hassle about it. Her family, she left a husband and 5 boys. In fact, one of her sons she had gone to pick up from college, and they were all in the accident. And so this Bob Foley, his name was, called me up and said, I don't know what to do, and I know you, can you help us? I said, I don't know. So I started making some phone calls. Well, this turned into, I mean, I had to call everybody but the governor at that point, and I probably would have called him because I thought this was so unfair. One phone call left to another and to another and to another. It took me about a week and a half, but I finally got through to people where they reversed the decision, and this family was then able to collect the money that was then due them for this, because she was in the retirement system. Well, all of the things as I was going along and generating one phone call, which generated another, I just started getting interested. So once I finished with that, all of a sudden people knew what I did, and they came to me and said, can you help us with this, and can you help us with that? So one thing led to another, and I got the fever. And I really call it an eternal fever, because once you do something like that and you see an end result that you really helped someone. So from there, I contacted the people in the union, who at that point was a person by the name of Martin Koenig. And he was newly elected. He worked for probation. And he says, oh, yes, we'd love to have you join us. And so I went in and started going to some meetings and immediately got on a social committee, because I think that's what they did with all the women in those days. You put them on social committees. And from the social committee, I started going to their local meetings and looking at training, and I got into Cornell. And at that particular point, our health department in Monroe County did not have its own CSEA. We were part of the Department of Social Services. And so at that particular point, I took the bull by the horns and said, that's it, we're having a health department at that point unit. And we did. We formed one, and I became the president of that, and I think the rest of it is sort of history. We had a tremendously active group. I started getting involved in negotiations then. And long about the end of the 70s, right around 79, towards the 80s, the president became very threatened by me and felt that I was just doing too much. And so he started putting the kibosh on what I could do and where I could go. And if I wanted to go to a training, I was not allowed to do that. And so I ran against him for the next election, and I beat him.
Who was that?
His name was Martin Koenig. He was an
it was Martin.
Yeah, he was an 8-year incumbent. He was also the board rep for Monroe County. He was the local president and did some very good things. Brought CSEA out of the association phase into a union. Made sure that our contracts, which at that point were handshakes over a table, were written contracts. And so he did a very good job. But when he turned on me a little bit, I didn't like it, and I ended up beating him. And then I became the unit president in 1981 of the Monroe County local and unit. And actually, it was the unit at that point I became the president of, because the local and the unit split off. And at that time, ended up being the president until I became region president. So what happens with you, as I said, the eternal fever gets you, and then you just want to know more. I went to Cornell. took the labor studies course,
Oh, good,
the
yeah.
certificate program, and graduated from that. And that really opened my mind, my eyes and my mind to a labor community out there, the carpenters and other public employee unions and the teachers and the building trades and some of the CWA and so on were in my class, and we started talking. So I became very interested in the labor community at that point, and then went to the local and said, we need to join this AFL-CIO group, which we did. And we've been active in there ever since, and very much a part of the direction of the labor movement in Rochester. So then I became a region officer under Bob Latimer, his first VP for many years, and that sort of acclimated me to the region and to the 14-county area that we represent. And so when Bob decided to retire, then it was my turn, I felt, to really take over the reins. And that's what happened.
Now, do you come from a family that was part of labor?
Well, interestingly, I have two sides to my family. My mother's side of the family was very business-oriented. They owned a little grocery store, and the Republicans had been very good to them, especially during the Depression and all that, and so they were very much business-oriented and not union-oriented at all. My father's family were immigrants who came and belonged to at that time it was the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. And my two aunts were very, very involved in their union. And we used to trade stories because as they got older, they told me about how Sam Popick, who was their business agent, used to walk in and say, there's a union meeting tonight, you be there. And nobody dared miss that meeting. And they had hundreds of people at union meetings when they would call them. So that was the side of my family that was union-oriented, and when I grew up, I really grew up very not knowing much about unions or labor unions and really not getting involved in the labor union movement until I started working in the health department.
Yeah, interesting. I have a very similar background.
Really?
Yeah, my mother's side was the grocery store.
Uh-huh.
And my father and his brothers were working in the factories in Troy.
Right.
They were part of the same union.
When my grandpa first came over from Italy, he worked in the coal mines in Pennsylvania, and then decided to move here with he and his brothers, and then they moved here, and that's when they got to the clothing factories and then brought their wives over. So that was a long time ago, but it's a wonderful history, and thankfully my aunts both shared a lot of that with us before they passed away, so that we have some history of what happened.
Yeah. So in fact, I've been talking to everybody about how everybody that's part of the history of CSEA got what you call the fever. I call it a conviction. You get a taste of what should be done.
That's right.
And you go and you do it, and you find you got people behind you helping you, and that's what a union is.
See, I am a member person. Even as an officer, I keep being reminded all the time that I'm a management individual now, and I'll never think like a manager.
Yeah.
I have to tell you that I am member-oriented, and I will always be that way. And we had a tremendous, in fact, many of the people that started with me in the union were either promoted into a management-type positions or MC positions, or they've retired. And we still once in a while get together and just talk about the old days. We went on strike in '77, by the way. We had a 3-day strike in Monroe County. And I know that one of our fellows who was on strike with us figured out how far we all walked, because everybody went out.
Tell me more about that.
Oh.
When strike happened?
There was negotiations in the 70s, it was back in '76, and there were some budget problems happening. And back in December 7th, I can tell you, 1976, there was a county legislature meeting where the county legislature decided that they were going to cut everyone's salary over a certain amount, 10%, and then there was an interim place where they cut everybody else's 5%. Well, this is without, by the way, any negotiation. And we had a legislature meeting that there were 200 of us that were there until 6 o'clock in the morning, because they kept taking recesses, figuring we would go and we would leave because we hadn't had any supper, and we had come right after work, and we all stayed there till 6 in the morning until they took this vote.
Where was this?
In the Monroe County legislature in Rochester, New York. And From there, negotiations went from bad to worse, and one thing led to another, and there was a strike called in August 22nd to the 24th in 1977. I still have the sign, by the way, that says Monroe County employees will not be working today. And it was over wages. It was also over this issue of the 5 and 10% pay cut. By the way, which was deemed illegal afterwards, because we did take them to court on it. They also cut home relief, which was mandated by the state of New York at that point for social service clients.
Why did they think they had this power?
Well,
And
if
who were
you,
they? I
you
mean, who are
have to,
these
these
people?
are the Monroe County legislators
You named them,
who,
it's okay.
oh yeah, one, the two specifically, his name was John Hoff, and many others who just joined the ranks, Joe Ferrari, and people who had been good friends of ours up to that point. And they
What was
just,
the impetus for this?
the impetus was that there was significant budget problems, and there were starting deficits from New York State over, obviously, the Medicaid, which is still prevalent now, but at that particular point, they thought the best thing they could do is just cut everything, not realizing that those were mandated programs by the state of New York. So anyway, so to make a long story longer, they ended up trying to do that, which was the impetus that caused a strike in August. We went out for 3 days. It was a tremendously successful strike. We have several work locations, all of them were on strike. But the biggest help we had was our pure waters, our sewage treatment plant people who went out on strike in force, and there was nobody to monitor. And so sewage started seeping into the lake, and the county was then going to be, of course, somebody, I don't know who it was, called the Environmental Protection Agency to check that out. And when they checked it out, they found out that sewage certainly was seeping into the lake, and Monroe County was going to be fined significantly, and that put everybody back to the table, and the strike was settled within 2 days. So it was the time of my life. But one of our fellas,
Now, was the strike legal?
no, we all went on strike. It was illegal. I still have, by the way, in my personnel file in Monroe County, the letter that tells me that I performed an illegal action. We were fined, by the way, heavily, 2 days' pay for every day that we were off. So we lost 6 days' pay for the 3 days that we were off.
Did you fight that?
We did, but it was the law, and there was nothing we could do about it. Many times I've tried to have that memo removed from my file, and others also, but they will refuse to do that. And I said, well, you know something? I want it to stay there. I want people to know that I did that. That was important for me to do that. In fact, I'm going to get a copy of that one day and frame it, put it on the wall.
Badge, right? Badge
That's
of
right,
honor.
badge of honor. But we did settle our strike after that, and that only brought a really cohesiveness to the union after that. And it was a great time in Monroe County. I think that could be, too, why I was lucky enough to win the election in the early 80s and become unit president. I did many contracts. I've done probably at least, where I was the president, at least 6 contracts, and before that was on the negotiating team for 2 others. We never lost a benefit in Monroe County. I pride myself on always being very open in the negotiating process, making sure people understood and knew what we were after and what we were going for, and very responsive to members. I think that's the most important thing we can learn from this union, is always respond to the members.
Good, that's good. Now, during the strike, did you have help from Albany?
Yes, we did. We had, well, actually from the region. All of our staff from the region came in. There were people there from Albany also. Our strike captains who were at each location was a staff person. And they were moved around from day to day because at some point the law was looking for them.
Sure.
And they moved around from one hotel to another. But they were always there and very supportive. I can name right now Bob Young, who was he's retired now. He was a field rep for CSEA, collective bargaining specialist, I believe at that time the title was. And Bob Young was my captain. First time I had ever met the man in my life, and he was absolutely stupendous. He supported us. He did everything he could to help us and make sure we understood what we were doing, why we were doing it. Made sure he really dealt with the rank and file, who started to get a little bit discouraged after a day or so. He was wonderful, and as was anyone else who was in that thing. I could only speak to what was going on at my work location. But we figured in 2 days we walked from Rochester to New Orleans and back. With the number of people walking and the number of steps, the average, we have somebody who was very technical, figured out the average number of steps per person, and we walked from Rochester to New Orleans in 3 days and back. I have to admit, I would have probably rather have been in New Orleans during this was all going on. It was a tough time. It was a tough time.
Yeah, but that's good old-fashioned unionism.
And as I said, people stuck together, and people really, even though they knew right up front what the penalties would be, I mean, there was no question that we were going to be penalized financially, and some attempts were made to penalize them also through their workplace and discipline them afterwards. I'll tell you a story. When we were going on strike, I happened to be the supervisor at that point of all the clerical staff, and we had all of the records for the nursing division. I don't know how many people actually know this, but the day that we went on strike, when the strike was declared, our health director got everybody together on that Friday afternoon and said, "We know you may not be back Monday, and I just want you to know whatever you have to do, you do." And he supported us on it. But just to make sure, I happened to be the keeper of the keys. I just happened to walk off with every key to every lock file there was, so that nobody could get any information on any of the patients or the clients or whatever. And they were all looking for these keys for a long time, but they appeared. But after the strike was over, the keys were back there.
Great. I love stories like that.
Oh,
That's what makes it a union a union.
Can I go back to the
You can do it.
story of the lady who lost her life?
Sure. Yeah, we've
The
gone.
reason that I started getting involved?
Yeah.
That woman who died, Madeline Foley was her name, many years later, the son that she went to pick up, his name is Terry Foley, became the unit president of the town of Greece CSEA. Which is highway workers in the town of Greece. It's a small suburb. Actually, it's a large suburb on the outside of Rochester, where I now live. But Terry Foley became the unit president for many years in that particular unit. That was his way. He said some ways of repaying CSEA for what they did when his mom passed away. And I always thought that was sort of a nice story, and just made it all worthwhile. It sort of all tied it together many years down the road.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. Wow. So tell us about some of the personalities that you come in contact with in CSEA.
Well, when I started with CSEA, I told you about Marty Koenig, who I thought really brought CSEA in Monroe County into the 20th century and really brought the Taylor Law. He was very obstinate man and really didn't get along too well with management, which I didn't think was too bad, but when it really did cause a lot of problems. Bill McGowan was the first president I knew. I had heard about Ted Wenzel, but I only heard about him. I really never knew him or of him. But during that era was the era, Joe Donahue was the president at that point, had just become president of Region 1. Joe McDermott, at that point, was not an officer. He was a Region 4 president. Looking back at some of the people who sort of have been our history, that's really as far as I could go. Bob Latimer had just become the Region 6 president because Bill McGowan had just become the statewide president, and Bob moved up. Ramona Gallagher, who was here before me, was the third VP of the region. And I will tell you a story. When I went to my very first meeting in Batavia, one of our ex-attorneys, her name is Marge Carew, she was doing a course on, or a little workshop on CETA, the CETA program, which had just started in the federal government, allowing people to come in entry-level positions and work their way up. I went to a meeting in Batavia, and I knew nobody. I knew no one in the room. I walked in, this room was filled. And one woman came up to me and put her hand out to me and said, "Hi, my name is Ramona Gallagher, and you're new here, aren't you?" And I said, yes, I am, and I was a bit intimidated. That's a little unusual for me to be intimidated, but I was. And she came over and she said, please join us, and she introduced me to Bob Latimer, and she insisted that I have lunch with them at their table. And if it wasn't for that, I don't know if I would have ever gone back to a regional type meeting, only because I didn't know anybody and no one made any. And I always learned from that lesson that when I go into a room and I see someone who doesn't look familiar to me, or maybe I haven't seen before, I try to go up to them always and introduce myself and say, are you new? Is this the first time you've been here? Because it's so important that people feel some type of comfort when they come to these things. Otherwise, some of them won't come back. So that's Ramona. And of course, I've worked with some of the best. Bernie Ryan, who was at that point our political action, I got very involved in the political action committee. I became chair of the judicial board, which was from its inception. Actually, I was a member of the judicial board and then 2 years later became the chair. And that was from the time it started, where it's an internal process that we started, an internal tribunal, sort of to look at problems internal to CSEA as opposed to bringing them out, keeping your laundry inside. And I became chair of that and worked with some wonderful people like an Eva Katz and a Bill Soul, who have retired since from CSEA, longtime activists. In Region 6, people like Sam McGavero and Charlie Parator, who you mentioned. People like Dominic Spicone, who was sort of an anti-anything I believed in, but always was a very, very fine person to talk to and never really stopped talking to you because you didn't agree with his position. Was another that was a long history here in Region 6. Many of the people, there was an assemblyman by the name of Frank Tolomi, who before that had been the Western Conference president of CSEA, which was originally the Western region. It was Western Conference. So those people, which really I didn't know from the beginning, but I sort of got involved with them somewhat. And of course the current officers, Mary Sullivan, Maureen Malone, who at that point were chairs of the local government workshop. I got on the board in '86, statewide board, and then became a board rep for Monroe County and enjoyed that tremendously. Caused a lot of problems there.
Well, yeah, what kind of problem?
Oh, well, I'm one of these people that I don't like someone to put something under my nose and say, vote on it. Mm-hmm. And so whenever that happened, I would make sure that I made sure people didn't say, we're going to just vote on it. So let's ask some questions. Let's table it to the next meeting. And of course, sometimes presidents don't like that because if they want something passed, they want it passed. And I'm not the kind of person that does that.
What kind of issues are we talking about?
Well, we were talking about issues of like financial issues of buying computers. We were talking about changing the titles of the labor relations specialists currently now, or the field reps, which had actually been approved by their union, but we didn't know what the ramifications would be for CSEA. Those are just some of them. There was a lot of them over the years that I was pretty cantankerous over, budgets. But it's funny because now you're in an entirely different situation with those same issues, it being an officer of the union. So it's sometimes a little difficult to separate that out.
Right. What was it like working with Bob when he was region president?
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There
We didn't.
There are a lot of different opinions about Bob.
Absolutely. And I will tell you that we didn't agree on everything. We didn't always see eye to eye on every single thing, but I always respected, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Bob Latimer. I think that he did a wonderful job as a region president. I think the past just years before he left were difficult ones for him because of his health. But I think that he really brought a new sort of outlook to Region 6. And at one point, under Bob Latimer, Region 6 was a totally united region. Very, very cohesive, stuck together. In fact, we were called the animals by Bill McGowan. Yeah, this was at the time when they were, this was another major confrontation in the union, was when the law firm of Romer and Featherstone was under fire, and they were obviously thinking of firing that law firm. And Bob and I stood shoulder to shoulder with a Joe McDermott and so on to try and get that overturned and not have that happen, because I believe Romer and Featherstone were absolutely phenomenal attorneys for this and did a great job for us. And so because of that, that was a major issue that we were all involved in. And I just totally lost my whole train of thought.
It's okay, it's just your respect for Bob.
Oh, right. And at that particular point, we were at a delegates meeting. And Bill McGowan, I got up at the mic and really was challenging him about the cost and what was happening and so on. And he just screamed, everybody behind me was sort of making a lot of noise. And he says, don't pay any attention to those. Those are just the animals from Region 6. Well, of course, Bill McGowan came from Region 6. And the whole place. And we still have our shirts, by the way. I figured if I would have brought one.
I would love to see
We
it.
had a Region 6 shirt with all the animals on the front part, and then on the back, of course, our map and Region 6 CSEA on it. But yeah, it was the region animals. And that became our mascot. I mean, really a mascot for many, many years. I have somebody made me a pillow out of the T-shirt, and it just dawned on me, I'm going to bring that in here. I still have it.
Picture of that.
Okay, I
That'll
can
probably
get
go in the
you.
history book that we're gonna
That
do.
is a classic here, and this was pretty much, let's see, they were fired in '86, I believe, so I'm pretty sure that it was just shortly before that, '85, that this all happened. And around '86 is when we had the T-shirt made with the Region 6 animals on it. So something that we were very proud of, by the way. So, but under Bob, I mean, it really was a very cohesive, very good group. As I said, whether I agreed or disagreed with him when we left that room, after we had our discussion about, and I was able to disagree, I always had a tremendous respect and supported what the consensus of the group was. And no, I think he did a marvelous job as a region president. The other thing about Bob, he was always, was never a person that agreed totally with anybody. He always brought up the sort of the other side of the picture. And I thought that was good. And that's a lesson I learned from him, is that whenever anybody talks to you about a procedure or changing a policy, try to look at what the other side of that is so that you can really make an informed decision, I think. I think Bob also was one of a breed that is no longer in the union. Unfortunately, I think people come on to our board and they come into being officers, thinking that they have to agree with everything that is being said and done because Albany says it's so, and that's not necessarily true. And I think Region 6 probably is the most questioning region, challenging region, and I like that about them. I may not always agree with them, and I may sometimes get mad at the way they think, but I've always respected it, and I think that we need to do that. I think we need to be challenged, and we need to have people say, I don't think that's the right thing you're doing, and tell me why. But as I said, Bob Latimer, Ramona Gallagher did a significant amount of work. We've had other officers in our region that were also Terry Melvin, who is now the assistant to the president, was our secretary. We had people like Candy Saxon, who's an LRS, who was former officer of this region.
An
Yeah.
LRS?
A labor relations specialist,
Oh,
is now a staff person
I
with
don't know.
CSEA.
Shorthand.
Yeah, she went on to be statewide secretary and then came back and became a labor relations specialist. And that's, by the way, another thing about our region. I think we have more staff people who were part of the ranks, who were either local presidents or officers in their locals, who have come on staff and I think have done a yeoman's job because of their knowledge of what the members go through and what officers sort of experience And I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah. Now,
Oh, by the way,
What?
one of the really great things that happened to me in this union was Solidarity Day of 1981. When I went to Washington on a bus and marched in 150 degrees, I think, in Washington streets to, we were waiting to pass fountains so we could just dip our foot or our hand in the fountains. That was one of the most exciting things, when they had to actually turn a fire hose on us just to keep us cool, because there were people really becoming very ill. But that was an exciting experience to see hundreds of thousands of people in their union shirts just sticking together and being there for a cause of just solidarity. I thought it was wonderful.
like the Woodstock of union.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's a great way to describe it.
Wonderful. Yeah. Let's get back to some of the other personalities. Now, you, McGowan versus McDermott. What happened there? What's your take on what happened between those two?
I think personally that there was just a real total disagreement in style. Bill was basically a member person. I will tell you that I never had a lot of dealings with Bill McGowan, but no matter whether I agreed with him or disagreed with him, Bill McGowan never took me off a committee, never stopped giving me an assignment because of the fact that I disagreed with him. I was the chair of the judicial board at that point, and was very, I took that job very seriously. And many of the things that we did in the judicial board didn't really agree with what the president or what the officers would want to do. I never, ever once was called into Bill McGowan's office to say, I don't like what you did, you should have not done that, and because of that, you're not going to be on the committee anymore. I cannot say the same thing for Joe McDermott. When McDermott came into power, Joe is a great guy. In fact, I get along with him much better now than I did when he was president. Joe is a corporation person. He really felt that the corporate level of CSEA was much more important. Spent a lot of time in the office, a lot of time with the first level managers. I think that, and Bill McGowan didn't do that. I think the major difference between the two of them was style. The second difference was their belief in what was the best for the union and how that should be accomplished. And what I meant by that is, obviously, the Romer and Featherstone issue became, I think, the dividing line there. I think McGowan always knew that McDermott wanted his job. And to Joe's credit, he didn't take the job until after Bill retired. But I liked Bill McGowan. I liked him for his member involvement. I liked him for his sort of just simpleness. You know, he chewed on his cigar and just, told it like it was. And he came from the ranks. He came from, at that point, it was West Seneca DDS, West Seneca Developmental Center, where he was for many years, active. Joe, on the other hand, was from DOT, who was basically in the managerial structure. I don't know if Joe ever really understood the nitty-gritty of the poor guy who was the laborer, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just saying I don't think from his perspective that people ever thought about where Bill came from, the laborer structure. And as I said, I think just a dividing of style, and then the divisive issue of the law firm really just split them apart. But once Joe became president, I think I argued more with him than I did with any other president in this union. And that is, not that I knew that many. I knew Bill McGowan, I know Joe McDermott, I know Danny Donahue. Joe was, as I said, I object to the corporation being the important part of this union. I think that members, and if we don't continue to remember that our grassroots memberships is what counts in this union, and if we don't get them active, involved, and knowing about this union, then this union as far as I'm concerned, not worth its salt. Danny is a good combination.
Uh-huh.
I think Danny Donahue, moving from Jim McDermott to Donahue, Danny is a member person, gets out with the members, but yet still deals in the structure of his managers and so on. Sometimes I'm not happy with their decisions because I don't know whether they're his or his managers, but at this particular point, I have to tell you that I think that there's a happier medium there of both corporation and membership than there ever has been.
Good. That's a good picture of the difference in the three.
I think that,
Yeah.
I think
That's good.
really and truly, and I think Danny gets himself on the road.
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
Danny has excelled, I think, in this union, and I think Joe started this, was the really relationship with AFSCME and the relationship with the AFL-CIO and the relationship within the labor community, I think has been enhanced. I think it was started by Joe, and I think it has been really continued by Danny Donahue.
Now, the involvement with AFSCME,
Mm-hmm.
do you have anything to do with any of that?
No, in fact, I was just, as I said, it was around 1978.
Oh, yeah.
Bob Latimer was very involved in that.
Yeah.
He was part of that group that was locked in a room.
Yeah, we just talked to him.
And I heard the stories, and I knew at that particular point that we were going to affiliate, and I heard basically most of the stories later on. In fact, Marty Koenig, who at that point was the president, was also part of that coup
Sure.
that got locked in a room in headquarters and really talked about the affiliation and who came out with and I think Bob, by the way, was one of the biggest supporters of that affiliation. We had lost PS&T, and I was around for that. And as a matter of fact, I have to tell you that if we wouldn't have lost PS&T, I probably wouldn't be sitting here.
Oh, yeah?
The major leaders of our region at that point, and in many cases of this CSEA across the state, were the PS&T, people who went with PS&T. And what ended up happening is once those people were moved into another union, it sort of left openings for some of us to move up. Otherwise, I would guess that a lot of us that are in a leadership role now and took a leadership role on from the 80s to the 90s would probably not be here. Because they were they were the top level. And in this particular region, I remember a Peter Blaisdell who was very much, but they, again, and Bob and Joe, Bob Latimer and Joe McDermott would have both been PS&T had their job structure not been changed and moved into the CSEA bargaining unit. Neither one of them would be with us. So, but that was, I was right at the tail end of that, and but I was at the first AFSCME convention that we held together in 1980. It was in Anaheim, California. It was in the, it was very new to me because I had never been to a convention with that many people, and it was sort of a little bit of a abstinence for CSEA because we had to elect at that point our international vice presidents, of which we had, I believe, at that time 2. And there was tremendous challenges within our own union. And of course, we never knew this, but at an AFSCME convention, there is no antagonism at all. I mean, everything comes the way the president wants it. At that time, it was Jerry Worf. Jerry Worf came in and, he tells everybody what you're doing. And when it came to CSEA, of course, he couldn't do that. So everybody was running against everybody else for these 2 international vice presidencies, which was quite an eye-opener for me. And not knowing anything about the international at that point, I was not too thrilled with it by the end of that convention. The best thing that happened to me that convention was the Yankees were playing in Anaheim, and I ended up, I don't know if you know, but I'm a diehard Yankee fan.
No, I didn't know.
And the Yankees were playing the Anaheim Angels, and it was in the old stadium in Anaheim. And we all went to the game, and they stayed in our hotel. I was at the Hyatt, and the Yanks stayed at our hotel. Oh, I have a Boston fan here. I tell you, if they weren't so nasty to me, I would like them. So, but anyway, it was it was a great week because it really brought CSEA, it was the first time
Okay, all right, so we're back.
I was in, it was the first time CSEA, we were basically always a regional type thing. We always stuck with our regions, we always did things with our regions. Very few of us knew anybody outside of it unless you were on a committee with them. And it was the first time that CSEA all stayed at this Hyatt, I think it was a Hyatt at that point, and when we went to the, when we got together, for example, at meetings, when we got together at socially, we would finish with our meetings at 3:30 in the afternoon and go to the pool. And all of a sudden, it was a CSEA function. It wasn't Region 6 versus Region 1 or Region 2 versus Region 4. It was all of us together. And I think that was when I started to realize that, you know, we were just part of this much bigger organization. And of course, I was local government at that point. We were in the minority in CSEA. So what ended up happening was, I think it just sort of brought people together. And it gave me a knowledge of really where we needed to go, that we needed to not be local government. We needed not to be state government. We needed to be CSEA. And I think that's the first time that I ever really realized it at that convention. And I haven't missed a convention since then. I was lucky enough to be elected to go on the ballots for the other conventions. And I certainly see a much different CSEA AFSCME relationship than I had. In this particular region, I will tell you there's an excellent relationship with AFSCME. And we've worked on some community issues together. We have a new director here by the name of Russ Clemens who has really done a fine job. Not that the other ones weren't as good, but there was never a real melding